we are driving emotion, but we're also being able to resonate with audiences and be representative of those audiences to drive affinity and community. Consumers or your audience are a lot closer to your brand than you think they are. There's a big difference between a fan who supports LAFC and LA Galaxy in LA. It's really important for them to feel representative, whether that's in content, whether that's in storytelling, whether that's in insights back into us. When you look at some of the fashion that is out at the moment, particularly whether it's jersey culture, whether it's sambas that are worn on feet or gazelles, it's all born out of sport and soccer first. For every Messi that you've got here who's enormous, you've also got LeBron James, Patrick Mahomes, Steph Curry, all playing other sports at the top of their games, who are amazing athletes. The space for conversation is a little bit different.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the Marketers Debrief podcast with me, Billy. Now, if you are watching this and you're wanting to know how emotion, authenticity and brand storytelling can drive your marketing, then today's guest may be able to help. Stu Gower is a senior manager in the brand marketing team at Adidas. Adidas or Adidas?
Correct, Adidas.
Nice.
I mean, you can go with either.
Nailed it. Stu, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. So this morning we held a fantastic Fuck the Formula event here in New York, which was where we covered how brand storytelling can drive modern marketing and can drive brand advocacy. And then you came at it particularly within the world of sport and soccer, because a big part of your role is the lofty challenge of trying to get Americans to love soccer. Zooming out a bit more widely, though, to start with, all sport is rooted in emotion and stories. It starts as a kid when you first pick up that bat or kick that football, and then it just drives from there. The pride and the passion that you get from when you're playing for yourself, for your school, then maybe your team, country, it's kind of like unrivaled, right? How crucial is it for sports brands such as Adidas to use that emotion and the good of sport in their own marketing?
I think it's really important. The first thing I'd say on that is to make sure and consider how you can inspire people. When working with Adidas, it's our brand statement or brand mission is really about how you can use sport to change lives. And I think that's really important when we consider how we're driving that conversation, how we're looking at athletes, partners, clubs, teams, federations, to really make sure that we are driving emotion, but we're also being able to resonate with audiences and be representative of those audiences to drive affinity and community. I think it's really, really important for us to be able to do that.
How much value is added to a campaign or to always-on marketing when it is driven through relatable, emotive stories?
A key part for me when I look at these things is how can you be very empathetic and understanding when it comes to the audience and the people that you're communicating with. There's a bit of disparity there when we talk about the consumer, because for Adidas as a sports brand, it's really important to look at a variety of consumers, which stretches a huge demographic, whether it's locally in North America or then even into the States or globally. So it's about us really being understanding and representative of those communities. And I think when we look at the value, I think the value is incredibly high, depending on which metrics you want to look at. I think they'll all drive in the direction of success because you have to stand for something, but your community then has to believe in you as a brand. I think even a lot of the brands that we work alongside with do that really well. And that's something that audiences really have affinity with.
I'm fascinated by the often fierce loyalty that consumers have to sports brands. You know, like if you're an Adidas guy or if you're a Puma guy, it's really difficult to go against that. I'm very much an Adidas man. I pretty much exclusively will only wear Adidas trainers and football boots or soccer boots. How do you go about cultivating that super loyal, engaged community, both offline and particularly online?
So I think it all starts within the same place, understanding who you're talking to. And when we look at football specifically or soccer, and let's look at it from like a global perspective first before we go like North America based. I was talking to someone about this before, and when you get introduced to someone in the UK, someone will always be like, hey, this is Billy, he's a Tottenham fan or an Arsenal fan. And like that's used as a that's used as like an identity for some people. And I think that just shows you the power that sports has. And I think the more equity that you can build into that from a sports brand's perspective, it really gets you to understand how that audience can then grow as a fan base of your own brand or logo. And when you think about logos, that's really what someone is representative of and believes in. And if you look at Adidas as an example, it's so esteemed in sports and football. it's probably not a surprise that you love football, you're interested in it. You then love Adidas because of that. And even from an Adidas perspective, it's a European country and it's a soccer or football first brand. So when you look at some of the fashion that is out at the moment, particularly whether it's jersey culture, whether it's sambas that are worn on feet or gazelles, it's all born out of sport and soccer first. And I think it's making sure that those touch points exist continuously, not just through what's happening on the pitch, but it's also bleeding into culture as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I never made that distinction between why I probably turned to Adidas is because of football. But then, you know, other sports like Nike, probably more associated with basketball.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Let's talk about soccer then. An incredibly exciting opportunity, and one that is really building momentum in driving the popularity of the sport here in the US. And am I right in saying that that's a big reason why you did move across from the UK?
Yeah, I think passion-wise, it's a really key part of what drives me. It's something that I love. It's what I love being around. And the opportunity to come over here and be a part of the growth of the game 4 or 5 years ago was something that I'm really interested in. I think even from a personal perspective, when you look at how the game is developing, when you're in the UK or Europe, or maybe even some countries in Latin America, etc., football or soccer is the number one sport by quite a distance. And that comes with just the audience and the visibility and the ease of tapping into conversations, or if people are looking at media titles to cover the game, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to be like in the mainstream. Whereas coming here, that doesn't quite exist in the same capacity. You've obviously got NBA, NFL, NHL, MLB, just to name like 5. Soccer's not quite at that level yet, or it's rising and going through the ranks there. And not to say it'll ever be as big as the NFL or the NBA, but there's a great opportunity when you start looking at participation levels, interest, what's going on in the game, to be part of something that's growing and makes a difference. And that's great.
Yeah. Such a huge market to tap into as well. Like if the brand that can really crack it, you know, that's going to make a ton of money.
Yeah, and there's a real point of view, I think, if I talk about Adidas now, it's Nike is so far ahead of us in North America, but if we look at the participation levels of certain sports and the growth of that sport being soccer, and then what's happening in the market, there's a business case there really which suggests that if you can be in touch with that team, be the number one brand in football or soccer in the marketplace, then maybe that gap becomes smaller, and that's I guess what the objective is.
Yeah, for sure. Now there's a lesser known man called Lionel Messi who came over to the States, joined Inter Miami in July 2022.
Yeah.
We will probably likely look back on it as maybe like the moment that the blue touch paper was lit for soccer here in the US, because, you know, arguably the greatest footballer to have ever lived, perhaps, now playing football in his sort of twilight years here in America. Well, firstly, what was your role in kind of leveraging his first few days, weeks at Inter Miami, you know, wearing Adidas on his chest? Yeah,
so we have an amazing team of hundreds of people who work across the business to look at what happens when someone like Leo arrives into the marketplace from like a jersey perspective, from a supply chain perspective, etc. Mine was really thinking about, well, when he comes, how are we going to build and drive association with Adidas, and what's that first visual going to look like that we can share across the business and into retail and across all of those marketing touch points. So we partnered with an artist called Cole, who's an amazing digital artist who works himself, and then he uses like AI and Midjourney to create imagery. And he posted an image on social of like Leo coming out of pink smoke. And that really helped build into the campaign, and partnered with him in terms of what that visual could evolve into, how that story could get built out. So we really worked on that sort of like creative story and taking that into the mainstream. And he was a great creative partner on that, and came up with the concept, obviously, the pink smoke in terms of the jersey, but also what was going on in pink at the moment. So Barbie was out and was really influential in culture. So was Lil Uzi Vert's album was centered around the same color. So we had a lot of equity in the color, as well as the athlete as well, who was in conversation. So it was a really nice myriad of things coming together.
Yeah, interesting. Have you met Leo?
I have, but very briefly.
I didn't get into conversation with him.
No.
That's a shame. I really want to know what he's like. How much value can be placed on associating your brand with a star of that magnitude? You know, you think of like Tiger and Nike, like to be able to work with such a huge brand that is Leo Messi, well, you must feel very lucky.
Yeah.
The fact that Inter Miami are an Adidas team and he is therefore
Absolutely.
repping the brand.
Absolutely, yeah. It's incredible, and sometimes you have to come out of your Adidas bubble and talk to people about it to really understand. I wouldn't necessarily say who you're dealing with as like Leo as a person as much, but it's just to see what he can do for a sport. And I think it's the same as when you look at Tiger, and Nike is a great reference for golf. He sort of surpasses the sport. And if you look at Jordan in basketball and maybe LeBron previously, they are characters and people first and foremostly who are sort of transcending outside of a sport and being representative of a sport. So I think you see when you go around the US now, stadiums will be packed out, or they'll move from their standard stadium to bigger stadiums to go and watch Leo play. And that's an amazing impact to have on a sport itself. I'm sure it's a lot of weight to carry and see, and the expectation from a lot of people, but it's quite incredible to see an individual can have that much impact on a game.
Yeah. I wonder who will be potentially the next star that, you know, would hold that similar amount of like gravitas.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think even in the social media world and influencer world, I think that's even more prevalent and interesting. You've obviously got your KSIs and your Logan Pauls and Mr. Beast and everybody who sits in that world. Feels like I wouldn't say it's diminishing as such, but you can look at other sports and you're not going to have another Tiger Woods. But in golf, you struggle to see who that player is going to be. McIlroy's been amazing. Scheffler's been amazing. But we almost come from a generation of sports defining athletes, players, and people. And it'd be interesting to see how that evolves based on what's out there now in terms of influencer channels and conversation.
You've worked both sides of the pond. What are the differences that you've seen? What are the major differences that you've seen when trying to sell the love of soccer here in America? Like, what are maybe a US audience just not buying into that over in Europe they do?
I think first and foremostly, it's pay to play. That is a huge challenge. I think anyone that you hear in and around the game, I think Infantino was talking about it for FIFA the other day. The pay to play model that exists in the US is very different than how we grew up. And I always use that example of jumpers for goalposts when we used to play as kids. It doesn't cost anything. You just need a ball. You can go and play in garages, whatever. That doesn't happen here. And that barrier and accessibility to the sport is very real. So I think how we can evolve out of that model and make it accessible, make it for everybody on the street, even here in New York. You'll see a lot of people playing soccer or football, but you'll actually see loads more people playing basketball in courts that are already set up around the city and just turning up and playing. And that's what we need to encourage more of, I think. That's a real key one from a participation standpoint. And then in a conversation, I think it's the competitiveness, almost what I was saying earlier, is for every player, for every Messi that you've got here who's enormous, you've also got LeBron James, Patrick Mahomes, Steph Curry, and a select amount of other athletes all playing other sports at the top of their games who are amazing athletes. So the space for conversation is a little bit different, particularly when we start looking at platforms, media titles, etc., whoever we want to talk about these athletes. So they're the two I think are really key.
I wanted to touch upon local communities because the size of the US and its kind of wide diversity of nationalities, races, subcultures must offer both huge opportunities and challenges when you are trying to tap into such a wide array of cultures and communities. How do you go about doing that whilst not sacrificing brand authenticity?
So I think it's a really good question, and it's one I'm quite passionate about. And I think even when we look at how leagues and teams are operated here, it's very different to how almost we grew up to a point. And I always use the example, Arsenal were founded in 1886 from a workman's club in Woolwich. So the identity of the club will always stay the same, and they're amazing at doing that and building out that. When you go into, say, LA and LAFC and LA Galaxy, it's very different. They're a lot newer on that trajectory, but it's really about starting to build a community within and then being very representative of the community that you're working with. So there's a big difference between a fan who supports LAFC and LA Galaxy in LA and the building of those communities and people is really important for them to feel representative, whether that's in content, whether that's in storytelling, whether that's in insights back into us. I think it's really important for everybody to be able to pull on those, or not necessarily pull on those people, but work with them, make them feel included And I think that's like the growth area for all of the teams and clubs within the marketplace, is to be really representative and localized of their cities. And what you also get with the diversity that's happening in the US and the growth of diversity here is you're getting an amazing opportunity to showcase the power of soccer and football within the US too.
And it's quite difficult, but how do brands, businesses keep their ear to the ground of those communities and subcultures that they sort of operate in? Like, what are the best ways in knowing, what Joe on the street is actually giving a shit about?
I think it's trying to be as close to that person as possible. I think we talked about it a little bit this morning, but for want of a better phrase, consumers or your audience are a lot closer to your brand than you think they are. So all you have to do is edge. I say all you have to do, but you just have to edge a bit closer to them and be receptive to what they're saying and what you're hearing. So it's not always just about trying to put pitches in new cities. It's, well, how do you put floodlights in their local community pitches that people don't want to change? They just want light so they can play later. Or how do you make the game more accessible and give people support and security with travel? It's a lot of that, I think, and being able to be receptive to them. People saying, well, we actually don't want this, but this is where we see the support and the benefit of a company like Adidas potentially, or others.
Vertical content is something which is absolutely blown up in the past probably like 5 years. And it's such a amazing way to leverage bigger brand content for an online audience. How do you guys at Adidas go about utilizing those platforms to tell these stories that we've spoke about?
I think there's two ways, and I'll answer this from myself versus Adidas necessarily. I think there's one part which people like to use those frames or verticals as channels of distribution, which I think it's a functional way of working, and it provides rate returns and engagements and allows followings to grow, etc. I sort of see them as almost like vertical screens, which you can build ecosystems off. So it's not just about directing something onto a channel. It's, if you're telling a story on a vertical channel, well, how are you then going to leverage all of the other marketing levers to reinforce that story? What does it look like across media channels? What does it look like on .com? What does it look like in other areas? Because I think we can sometimes overlook the power of the depth of that story. You might only get 6 seconds, you might only get 60 seconds. We might be in a world now where there's more longer form content that's being eaten again, which I'm more of a longer content person, which isn't necessarily always in fashion, but I think it's important to think about how we can actually use those as a center point of an ecosystem.
Stu, it has been brilliant chatting to you. I could talk soccer all day, but with some really insightful stuff there. I'm going to end with the question that I end every podcast with, which is, if you could suggest one book for our book club community to pick up and read, what would it be and why?
It would be Adam Grant, Hidden Potential. I think it's really interesting what you can take away from his articulation and case studies of developing your own skill set and how you see and perceive the world, and can learn from people like that. It's something I'm quite interested in personally, but I think the way that he does it is really simple and it resonates. So that would be my addition. I'm sure several people might have said the same thing, but he's I really like it. I think he's great. Yeah,
he's a very inspirational man. I think he has been, one of his books has been read by the community already, but yeah, a great recommendation. Any sports books? Could throw in a biography if you want. Mine would be Alan Shearer's.
Would it?
Yeah.
Do you know what? I'm reading David Dean's at the moment.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, and because I'm back to football and maybe soccer and the inspiration there, but David Dean's really fascinating, and the way that he led the changing from Championship football or League One football to the Premier League, and the inspiration that he got from the US and how he wanted to commercialize the game was incredible, and the things that how they test cased different opportunities within the game at the early parts was great. So David Dean's book's been really good. I'm also an Arsenal fan, so that helps.
Nice. Stu, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks very much.